Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMindFactory and welcome to this next video from the series called Implementing Secure Applications with Microsoft Azure. In this video, we are going to talk about user authentication with Microsoft Entra External ID. So we are going to see how to secure access to our web application and also how to secure access to set of web APIs. So let's get back to the solution architecture diagram I presented in the first video in this series. So this is solution architecture diagram I created for this solution architecture for this application in the Microsoft Azure cloud. And in this video specifically, we are going to focus on user authentication, but also on authorization, because we are going to see how to access protected APIs. So as we can see on the right side, there are different kinds of applications, mobile applications, web applications. In our case, this is Blazor web application. And this application is secure with Microsoft Entra External ID, so with this identity provider. And also, there are two APIs hosted using Azure Containers Apps, Document API and File Upload API. So File Upload API is responsible for uploading files to Azure Blob Storage. And also, Document API is responsible for retrieving data from the database about scanned files and, like returning this in form of JSON data to web application. So this is the part of the solution we are going to focus on in this video. Great. So first of all, as always, it's good to talk a little bit about theory. So it's good to remind. Authentication is the process of verifying the identity of the user. So basically, we want to confirm who the user is. This is authentication. And also there is authorization. So this is the process of determining what an authenticated user is allowed to do. So we are answering the question, what can user do actually? So authentication and authorization, very important two terms that you have to remember about. So moving forward, when it comes to application integration with any identity provider, actually, so in this case, we talk about Microsoft Entra External ID, but this is basically like a standard. So you will see this approach with any other identity provider, like Auth0, for instance, or Okta. So when we integrate our application with an identity provider, once the user is authenticated, application will receive something what is called ID token. So in this ID token, there is information about the user identity. So this information is used by the application to confirm and answer the question actually who the user is. So in the ID token, there is information about the first name, last name, unique ID of the user, email, all the data related to user. So once the user is authenticated successfully, as we saw in the first video in this series, when user is authenticated, user is redirected back to the application. There is this information like this greeting, hello Daniel, as we saw in the first video in this series. If you didn't watch this, I recommend to do it. But also in this video, we will see the demo application again later, so you can see it in action. But long story short, ID token is issued by Entra External ID to application after user is successfully authenticated. And now, important fact is that we have to validate properly this ID token in our application. So, issuing ID token is not enough. We have to validate the content of this ID token and also the signature. So let's talk about the claims validation here and actually the ID token validation. So first of all, we have to validate the audience. So audience, it identifies the client application. So basically under the audience claim in the token, we will see the client ID of our web application that we register in Microsoft Entra External ID. That's very important. So every time when we see ID token under the audience claim, we will see the client ID of the application where user successfully authenticated. Okay, that's very important. There is also issuer claim. So basically, issuer claim indicates who issued this token. So it's about the identity provider here. On the left side, you can see decoded ID token, and you can see that under ESS, so issuer claim, you can see the unique value. So this is the issuer value for my Microsoft Entra External ID tenant. So I can confirm that this ID token was really issued by this specific Entra External ID tenant. Expiration time, also to check if token is still valid. You know, like maybe data in the token is stale, maybe token expired. It's very important to check the expiration time of the token to make sure that, you know, like it's still valid, because if not, we will have to ask user to authenticate again. And the signature, again, very important thing here. So token is signed actually. And what we have to do, we have to check this signature, validate the signature. So basically, we have to use the public key, and it's called public key infrastructure actually. So there is a set of keys, public key and private key. So what we have to do, the token is signed with the private key on the identity provider side, so by Microsoft Entra External ID. And also there is a public key that is available publicly. We can actually call a specific endpoint on identity provider side to get information about the public key, and we can check the signature, whether this ID token was really signed by this specific identity provider, which is in our case Microsoft Entra External ID. An important information to remember: the ID token never contains scopes. Okay, that's very important to remember. You will never see scope claim in the ID token. Okay, why? Because we are not accessing any protected resource. Scope claim is used in the access tokens to make sure that application can access specific functionalities or basically access web API on behalf of authenticated user. But in case of ID tokens, we never see scope claim in the ID token. Perfect. So once we understand the authentication process and we understand that ID token is used using OpenID Connect standard, we have to also talk a little bit more about the access tokens. So in this case, we talk about OAuth 2 standard. So when it comes to ID token validation and basically, you know, like this communication I mentioned before, here we talk about OpenID Connect. So OpenID Connect is the standard that enables us to get information about the authenticated user in form of ID token. And also there is OAuth 2 standard, which is used to issue access tokens actually. So when we want to access protected resource like web API, we need to have an access token. So this access token is included in the authorization header in the HTTP request. It's passed to web API, and web API is responsible for validating this access token. So it's very important to secure our web APIs. So once the user is authenticated, application will not only obtain an ID token to confirm who the user is, but also application can obtain an access token that can be used to access protected resources like API. And obviously a refresh token to refresh those tokens without the user, without the need for user to re-authenticate again. So again, when it comes to access token validation, it's very important to understand what should be validated here. So access token should never be inspected by the client application, so by our Blazor application in this case. Access token is meant to be used by protected resources, so APIs. So on the API side, once the token is received, we have to validate different kinds of things around access token. So first of all, we have to validate the audience claim, and under audience claim, this time, this identifies the API, the resource. So under the audience claim in the access token, we will not see anymore the client application ID, which is Blazor in this case. We will see the client ID of our web API that we registered in Microsoft Entra External ID. That's what we will see in this video. So under the audience claims, we always see the client ID value of the app registration that we created for our API. We also have issuer, that's what I mentioned for ID token 2. So we have to check whether the token, access token to be more precise, was issued by specific identity provider, in this case Microsoft Entra External ID. Expiration time, very important still, because again, if the token is expired, we should not accept it, and we should not allow to proceed with different kinds of operations on API side. Signature, again, the same process as for ID tokens. We have to validate the signature, whether it was signed by the identity provider we trust actually. And scope. As you remember, scope is not available in the ID token, but it is available in the access token. So scope is used to validate the access level for the client application accessing API or protected resource. So in this case, scope is used to confirm whether application can access specific endpoint or functionality on the protected resource side on behalf of authenticated user. Okay. So just to summarize, because obviously this video is not specifically about OpenID Connect, OAuth and tokens, but I thought that it will be really valuable to mention some differences here because there is a lot of confusion, especially for developers. So ID token. ID token is intended for the client application. Okay, so when you hear ID token, it's meant to be used with client application where user authenticated. ID tokens identify the user to the application. So ID token is used to confirm the user identity, to answer this question, who the user is. Applications do not look at access tokens, only ID tokens. So you never use access token, you never, inspect access token on the client application side. And now on the other side, we have access tokens, and those are intended for the web APIs. And access tokens authorize the app for a range of operations on the API side on behalf of authenticated user. It's very important. We use an access token on behalf of authenticated user, and then API makes authorization decision whether to allow or not allow application to access specific endpoints or resources. And obviously we will see that we can also use access tokens without the user context. It's called machine-to-machine authorization. And so we will discuss this in another video in this series, but the case is that access token is intended to be used with web APIs. Web APIs never use ID tokens for authorization. This is super important to remember. I saw many situations where developers were using ID tokens against web APIs. That's wrong, guys. So every time you see ID token used with a web API, you can be sure that there is something wrong with the implementation. So access token for web APIs, ID token for client applications. That's what you have to remember. Great, so now it's time to see it in action. I want to explain some of those concepts in the source code and also in the Microsoft Entra External ID portal. So let's see it. So here is Microsoft Entra External ID open in the Microsoft Entra Admin Center. So this is my tenant that I created to secure all those applications and resources in my solution. So in this tenant, I can configure different kinds of things. So for instance, I can configure user flows. So configure the login and registration pages, also configure additional identity providers. So if users would like to sign in with Facebook or Google, they can also do it. So under identity providers, I can do it. But the most important thing I want to show you is about app registrations. That's what I mentioned before. So as you can see here, this is my secure cloud web application here. It's application registered in Entra External ID tenant. And this is my actually Blazor application. So if I switch to authentication, you will see that under redirect URL, I have this URL of my Azure web app. So this is the place where the token or tokens will be issued to my application. An important thing is that under overview, as you can see, I have the client ID here, and this client ID will be under the audience claim in the ID token. So once I register this application in Microsoft Entra External ID, once I set up authentication tab here, it's web application, so Blazor server app, I have this redirect URI. Now I can configure my Blazor application. Before I will do it, important fact is that I also have app registrations created for APIs. So if I switch to another tab, you can see that I have Secure Cloud Documents API application register here. So it's exactly the same situation. Like each application I use in this solution is registered in Microsoft Entra External ID. Now let me switch to Visual Studio to explain some of the source code there. So here is Visual Studio and my Blazor application project opened. And let's discuss authentication here. So obviously I utilize dependency injection here. Let me open this specific extension method, add user authorization and authentication here. So as you can see here under services, I have services add authentication. And in this case, I use OpenID Connect authentication scheme because I want to receive ID tokens. And I have this method called add Microsoft Identity Web App. And here I load the configuration from the either local settings JSON file or Azure app configuration. It depends. But also important thing is that here I have this method called enable token acquisition to call downstream API. And add in memory token caches. It means that I can cache those tokens in the memory, it will be they can be utilized by the application. So as you can see here, I also have to add this configuration, load this configuration. So let's look at Microsoft Entra configuration here. So you remember I mentioned that we have to validate different things in our token. So you can see I have to provide the authority, the client ID, that's the ID I showed you in the Entra External ID portal, callback path, so where the token will be issued. And also a couple of other things here which we will use in the authentication process. So in this case, client secret, but also we can use client certificate in this specific scenario. When we look at the packages that are used here, when I click Manage Packages here, you will see hopefully soon, yes, that I'm using Microsoft Identity Web Package. This is a dedicated package that enables ASP.NET Core web applications and web APIs to use Microsoft Identity Platform, which is actually Microsoft Entra ID and External ID. So with this package here, I'm able to actually implement user authentication. So if I expand the components and shared folder, you can see that here I have this login display component, the Razor component, and here I'm using Microsoft Identity Web. And here I have two views, authorized view and unauthorized view. So if user is actually not authenticated, I'm displaying the login button. And if user is authenticated, I'm looking into the claims in the ID token to display this greeting. So hello and something else. So in this case, it was hello, Daniel, administrator. And obviously, once user is authenticated, I'm displaying the logout button. Perfect. So that's about the configuration here. And obviously, when I launch this application, I will have to authenticate. So I want to show you one more thing under the pages here. So let me show you documents page and file upload page actually. So as you can see here for the documents page, I also utilize this authorized view in Blazor. So if you are authorized, so in this case, if you are authenticated user, you will have access to this data grid, and actually we are displaying the data owned by the user. So all those invoices I showed you, all the information from the database like invoice ID, invoice date, and so on and so forth. If user is not authenticated, not authorized view will be displayed, and we will display this information. Please authenticate first. So it's super important to implement this. Exactly the same thing is implemented for file upload. As you can see, in this specific scenario, I also have authorized view. Then you can upload files. If not, you have to authenticate first. And important thing is that if you want to actually download anything from the API, grab some data from the API, here, as you can see, I'm checking whether user is authenticated, and I have this Documents API connector with getInvoicesAsync method. Let me open that really quickly. And here, as you can see, before making a request to the API, the GET request to get all the invoices for the user, I'm using this method called get and add API access token to authorization header async. Let me show you this method actually. So as you can see here, because of the fact that I'm using Microsoft Identity Web Library, I'm able to get an access token for specific API. Why? Because I'm using scopes here, which I will explain in a minute in the Entra External ID portal. So based on the scope, I can request access token for specific API. And then, as you can see, I can add this access token as barrier token to the authorization header, actually. So this is very important, this part, because if I will call this API without the access token, I will not be able to retrieve any data. Great, so now let's get back to Entra External ID portal and let's discuss the configuration for the APIs also. So here is Entra Admin Center again, and as we can see, there is a document API register. So let's explain what's going on here. So first of all, to obtain access tokens for Documents API, I have to register this API. So if I expand Essentials, you can see that there is client ID of this API. So this client ID will be included under audience claim in the access token. So that's what we discussed before in this video. So API will have to look into the access token, will have to check audience claim and check whether it matches this value here. Great. Under authentication, we don't need anything because that's an API, that's a resource. So we don't have any authentication here. It's purely about the authorization and accessing API on behalf of authenticated user. So we have to open Expose an API tab. And this is the place where, first of all, we have to define unique identifier for our API. So in this case, as you can see, is API and my client ID that we saw in the authentication tab. And also here I can define different scopes. Okay, so basically scopes are used for the delegated permissions. So based on the scopes, we can say, hey, this application can access this, let's say, endpoint on the API on behalf of authenticated user. So actually, an application can ask for different scopes, and then an application can access different functionalities or resources on the API side. I have one scope defined here, as you can see. It's called document.read. So this is the full scope value here. So I'm saying, hey, this application would like to access this protected resource, which is document API, and would like to read all the user's documents. And as you can see here, I have explanation for that. Important fact is that I have to grant those permissions here for this application to make sure that my Blazor app can actually ask for the access to this API, which we will see in a minute. But the thing is, I have to define the scope here, and I'm exposing my API. And now, if we get back to the Secure Cloud Web Application, let me show you that. Under API Permissions tab, here, as you can see, obviously I have more permissions here, but let's focus on the Secure Cloud Documents API. I have document.read permission. How it's possible? It's possible because I click Add Permissions, API my organization uses, and here, as you can see, let me check it. Where is it? There should be Secure Cloud Documents API. And as you can see, here is the scope I mentioned, document.read. So I'm adding this scope, I'm adding this permission, and I have to grant admin consent for this tenant. Why? Because, you know, like those scopes are not supported, dynamic scopes are not supported on the login screen by Entra ID. So users will not be asked for consent. I have to consent on behalf of my organization here. So it's important. So users will not see this screen like, hey, this application would like to access your documents. Do you agree? Because of the fact that I'm granting this as administrator, web application will be able to access documents on behalf of authenticated user. So as you can see here, admin consent required is set to yes, so that's why I consented, and now this application can request access to Documents API to read documents. Perfect. So now let's see the source code of the Document API to understand the structure, because for File Upload API it's pretty the same. So here is the Visual Studio, and let me expand Document API project. Of course, again, I'm using dependency injection here. Important fact is that when I right-click Manage NuGet Packages, you will see that under Install, I have exactly the same package used as before. So Microsoft Identity Web, okay? So this package is used to make it possible to integrate with Microsoft Entra External ID. It's much easier to do it. Now let me expand dependency injection. And here, as you can see, I have all those different kinds of things to inject different dependencies. But let me open Identity Service Collection extensions. So what's going on here? So first of all, I have to load the configuration, authorize access configuration. Let me show you the values here. As you can see, here is instance, tenant ID, client ID, and scopes. So those are the values that I have to fill out accordingly to the values displayed in the Microsoft Entra External ID to make it possible to validate the token. As you remember, I have to validate the audience claim, I have to validate the issuer claim, I have to validate the scope claim to make sure that client application can access this API on behalf of authenticated user. And also here under services that add authentication, I'm using a JWT barrier authentication scheme this time. And I have this method provided by Microsoft Identity Web library called Microsoft Identity Web API. And here I'm providing actually the configuration. And also additional thing is that I have this identity service implemented here to make it easier to extract different claims from the access token. So for instance, I have get user ID from the access token here, as you can see. So I'm extracting the object ID, which is unique identifier of the user in the Entra External ID. And also I can get user email from the access token here. So I have this additional method here. Perfect. So now when I open controllers and when I look at document controller, you can see that I have this authorize attribute here. So it means that no anonymous access is allowed for this controller. And also, as you can see here, I have require scope attribute. And this information will be taken from the configuration. Okay, so now if I expand app settings development JSON, I just want to show you this. As you can see under scopes, I have this document.read scope. So actually when Web API will be called, Web API will validate the access token, and one of the things it will check is the scope claim. So it will check whether there is document.read scope included in the access token. If it's included, then perfect. You can call get all invoices async here. And obviously there is some logic behind here. But the thing is that having an access token for the user is validated by the API, and then API can proceed with extracting the data from the SQL database and also to get information about the files stored in the Azure Blob storage. Great, so I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you will join me in the next video where we are going to talk about machine-to-machine authorization, or like communication between two applications without the user context actually. So I hope that you will join me, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.